Like, I'm not crazy thinking that, right? Like, if Jesus told us explicitly, I don't even know when I'm coming back, isn't it pretty arrogant to say, I figured it out? I mean, all right, welcome to Rex's Minute, a weekly video where I talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We are in week number 9 of our study of the Thessalonian letters, and we're in the last chapter of the first letter, so really excited for this. We are in, like I said, chapter 5, and we're going to be picking up where we left off last week because where we're at is essentially a continuation of what we talked about last week. So if you've been following along with this, you'll remember that the first 3 chapters were Paul talking to the church in Thessalonica about, what he'd heard about them, why he couldn't come visit them because, he was run out of town so quickly and he didn't get to set them up and establish them the way he wanted to. And so that's what the first 3 chapters are. And then chapter 4 is where he starts actually doing a little more teaching, maybe answering some of their questions he's heard from them, continuing some of the teaching that he left, he didn't get a chance to teach. And so the end of chapter 4, he starts talking about death. And what he's really talking about is Jesus' return in light of those who died. So it's pretty obvious here that there was a question brought up by the Thessalonian Christians that they wanted to know, like, number one, they expected Jesus to come back soon, and so did Paul at this point. That's clear from the language he used in this letter and in the second Thessalonian letter, which are his earliest letters that we have. We're pretty sure, right? There's always an asterisk with claims like that, but we're pretty sure that these are the earliest letters we have from him. And so he's expecting Jesus to come back very soon, and so the people have the question of, well, what about those who died? Like, this was a church that was suffering, that was some of them were dying for being Christians. That's part of the reason why Paul had to leave. And so they're wondering, like, what happens to them? Do they miss out on when Jesus comes back and they're already dead? And so Paul explains that. And so the last part of chapter 4 is Jesus' return as it pertains to those who have died. What we're going to look at today is Jesus' return as it pertains to those who are living, right? So really interesting stuff. This is a topic that a lot of people really dig into. So if you want to know a little bit more about it, stick with us, watch the rest of this video, and then go back and read it on your own. So that being said, let's read today's section. But as always, make sure you read it within the context of the entire letter, because this is a letter you would have sat down and read in one sitting or listened to somebody read it if you were part of the original audience. So make sure you go back and put this into context. Follow the train of thought, right? So, that being said, let's read this. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It says, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. For God did not destine us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing." So again, this is kind of a continuation from last week's study. But there's some key topics that, just in case you didn't watch it or you don't remember, I want to hit on really quickly, just so that we can use common language. So I don't use a big word and you're like, what's that mean? Like, all right, just let's recap a little bit. What we're looking at is a topic called eschatology, and that's the study of end times. Like, this is something that people were just as obsessed with 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote this letter as they are today. This is not something that is just a new infatuation. Like, this is something, if anything, they were more infatuated with it than we are today. And so it's important to understand that when Paul and John and Jesus and the apostles, the parts of their writings that we have that they use to describe what will happen at the end. If you remember last week, we used the illustration of it's like trying to describe color to a person who's never seen color, to a blind person, right? There's not really words to truly describe what's going to happen and what it looks like accurately. And so every description falls short. And so that's why it's so hard to study this. It's all very cryptic because we don't really have a frame of reference to understand what's going to happen back then. Some of the things we didn't talk about last week was that the Old Testament is full of discussions of the day of the Lord. The prophets specifically have a lot of references and descriptions of the day of the Lord, whether it's Isaiah 22:5, 13:9, Zephaniah 1:14-16, Amos 5:18, Jeremiah 37, Malachi 4:7, Joel 2:31. Like there's a bunch. And the view in the Old Testament was that it was going to be God ending this current evil age, right? So you have this evil age that we're currently in. The day of the Lord is when God would set up his new golden age that would last forever. All the bad things about this age would end. God would establish his kingdom forever, right? That's what they're looking forward to. And that was the way the Old Testament scholars, pre-Jesus and still current Jewish people, they're looking forward to, right? That's what they view. When we see that in light of Jesus, we understand that the day of the Lord is actually Jesus' second coming when he returns. And so the Old Testament, these descriptions of it always have three characteristics according to Barclay. They've said that it will happen suddenly and unexpectedly. They say that it will be a cosmic upheaval, aka like everything will be ruined, right? Like there will be a lot of destruction because this current age has to end. So everything that is kind of goes away and is reborn into something new and better, right? And the last thing, there is judgment. There is judgment of people, with the good, the bad, God's people, not God's people, okay? And so the second coming, as we understand it, is the returning of Jesus. Jesus left, he's going to come back, and it's going to fit that description. And Paul adheres to that. Matter of fact, all the descriptions of Judgment Day, of the Lord's Day, the day of the Lord, they fit those three characteristics. And so it's clear that those Old Testament prophecies, they're referring to Jesus' return. And so when Paul describes it, he echoes that language, right? When he's describing the day of the Lord Jesus' return, when he comes back, he's echoing it. And so, it's going to happen quickly and unexpectedly. Jesus called it a thief in the night 20 years before Paul wrote this letter. We best guess. And so that Paul borrows that language. He says Jesus is going to come back. It's going to be like a thief in the night. And what that means is it's going to be quick. It's going to be sudden. It's going to be unexpected. Because if you were expecting it, well, you'd be prepared for it. That might be Paul's point. We'll look at that in a minute, right? So it's going to happen quickly at night when most people aren't paying attention. There's going to be cosmic upheaval. What's that mean? That means that everything is going to go away that was, and it'll be remade into something new and better. As a matter of fact, it'll be what God initially designed it to be. We talked about that last week, and it's really important that you keep that in the forefront of your mind when you think about end times eschatology, right? If you want to sound smart. It's important that you remember that God he wanted to create a people to live in a place that he created for them and to be in his presence. God's people and God's place and God's presence. That's where creation started in the Garden of Eden. That's where it's going, right? So that's where we're headed. And so Judgment Day is the day of judgment, and all the heaven and earth pass away. We see in Revelation 21, and it's all remade as the way it should be. And heaven and earth are combined. So you have God's people and God's place and God's presence. And so that's that cosmic upheaval. And it's kind of like, it comes to that women in labor metaphor that Jesus and here Paul is using as well, that there's going to be some changes. And I'm going to leave it at that because this is not a biology class. And he also mentions peace and security in verse 3. What is that? Now, there's some debate on this, but it's most scholars who've studied this and looked at the history and the archaeology and the evidence, they're pretty sure that this was reference to a Roman propaganda piece. That Rome, if you've studied Roman history, you know that they're huge on the Pax Romana, which means Roman peace. Rome didn't care about your religion so much. They didn't care so much about your culture. They cared about your money. And they figured out very early on that if there's no infrastructure, if there's constant warfare, if there's constant rioting, there's not going to be any money. They're not going to be able to make money. They're not going to be able to pay taxes. So they were all about creating the Pax Romana, creating peace, where they would provide security. They would provide infrastructure. They would provide all the things necessary for economic growth, and you can do whatever you want with religion and culture as long as it supports us getting paid. That was Rome's view, and so they launched a propaganda machine that said, hey, trust us. Trust us to provide peace and security. It'll be better for you. I mean, Rome was great at that. The way that they conquered Britain was the southern tribes closest to the shore. The initial invasion failed, but after that, they launched an invasion of marketing and Romanization. They culturally defeated the southern tribes before they ever invaded again. So by the time they got there, the people were pretty well just like, hey, Rome sounds pretty great. Like, right? They made things better. So that's what Rome did. They launched propaganda campaigns, and that would have been well known, according to most scholars, that Paul here was referring to this peace and security propaganda, to trust in Rome. And what Paul is saying is not necessarily that Rome doesn't do those things, because evidence was pretty clear that they would, but that we shouldn't trust in it. And it's not going to last forever. And that's not something that we should put ultimate trust in at all. It's great. The government is supposed to provide peace and security. Paul explains that explicitly in his letter to the Roman church. But that's not where our ultimate trust lies. Our ultimate trust lies in Jesus and Christ crucified, and in the resurrection and God's promises. And so that's where Paul transitions. He says, all right, now this is how Christ's return affects those who are alive when he does, right? This is how you're supposed to be living until he returns. And so it's important to know that he's not describing what will happen here. He did that more so last week, but this week he's not really describing, exactly what's going to happen as much as he's describing how it's going to happen and how we respond to that and how we live in light that it's going to happen, okay? And so the first thing that Paul does is he makes a division between God's people and everybody else. And he uses really common language. He says that we, God's people, are supposed to be children of light. We're supposed to be awake. We're supposed to be sober. We're supposed to be vigilant. And everybody else are people of darkness. They're living in darkness. They're sleepy. They're drunk. All right. He uses a kind of a confusing metaphor there. But ultimately, it boils down to two things: paying attention and not paying attention. Right. For everyone else who's not God's people, he says they're in darkness, they're asleep, meaning they have no situational awareness. Now, this isn't referring to what we talked about last week, where asleep meant they were dead. Like, no, he's talking about being situationally aware, that if you are paying attention, you'll recognize that Jesus is coming, right? Like, you're constantly living your life in light of it. Not that you're going to know when it happens, but that you're going to pay attention, right? People who aren't God's people aren't going to pay attention. They're not going to be situationally aware. They're not going to live in light of Jesus' return. He says they're drunk. And when you're drunk, you're incapable of it. So this very well could be alcoholism or drugs or whatever. Like, that will definitely render you incapable of paying attention and living your life the right way. But it could also be things like success and work and relationships and jobs and anything else that just kind of becomes God for you. It renders you incapable because it's all you care about. You don't care about anything else. You might go to church, you might call yourself a Christian, but if Jesus isn't the center of your life and something else is, you're drunk, right? You're drunk. You're incapable of living your life the way Jesus wants you to, because you're so wrapped up, you're so caught up in whatever it is. Paul says we can't be that. We have to be sober, we have to be vigilant, we have to live our life the right way. And so for God's people, he says you have to be awake, right? N.T. Wright describes this as like having jet lag, right? If you ever traveled across time zones quickly, you know, like, your body doesn't get the message, right? Like, when I moved out to Las Vegas, it took me a solid week where, going from East Coast time zone to West Coast time zone, I would fall asleep at really inconvenient times. Like, I would be exhausted way before everybody else, and I would get up way before everybody else because my body was still on East Coast time. N.T. Wright says that's kind of like the way we're supposed to be as Christians. We're supposed to be wide awake while everybody else is asleep, right? The world around is asleep. We as Christians, as God's people, are supposed to be wide awake and waiting. We're vigilant. If a thief comes in the middle of the night and you're awake, well, that ruins their whole plan. Thieves don't come during the day because then they'd have a fight in their hand. That's not called a thief. That's called a raid, right? Thieves come in the night because they don't want to fight. So we need to be vigilant. We need to be awake. And we're not to be surprised. And this is kind of where Paul is getting to, right? We mentioned this a few minutes ago, that we are supposed to be living our lives vigilantly waiting for this. Now, notice what he did not tell us to do. He did not tell us to look for the signs, like to not tell us to try to figure out the date and the time. This is something that's always confused me with people who really, really get into the end time stuff and they try to pin down a date. And I don't mean any offense by this. I really don't. But it's almost sinful to say you figured out the time and date when Jesus himself wasn't given the time and date, right? Like, I'm not crazy thinking that, right? Like, if Jesus told us explicitly, I don't even know when I'm coming back, isn't it pretty arrogant to say, I figured it out? I mean, to me, that seems like a little bit of common sense here. Like, who are you to figure it out when Jesus himself doesn't even know, right? Like, there's just going to be a day when God says, all right, go, and Jesus returns. We're not supposed to know the date. We're not supposed to know the time, so don't worry about it. That's not the point. We are supposed to be aware, but the awareness should lead to righteous and holy living, not having your bunker built or whatever. Like, you're not going to be able to escape the end times. Nothing is. That's the whole point of it. Jesus does away with all the old stuff and brings about a better new stuff. So it's going to be a cosmic upheaval all the way down to its foundations. There's no escaping it. So the point is not to know the times, not to know the date. Like, it's to live righteously. It's to live in light of it, knowing that it is going to happen. So don't get caught up in it. Like, don't worry about the time and the date. Heaven is not the goal here. The goal is to be God's people, to be his hands, his feet to the world around us. That's the reason that we pay attention to Christ's return, because there are people that you should love and care about and want them to have what you have, to have that relationship with Jesus, to have redemption, to have a life that has purpose and meaning, to be saved from walking around as the walking dead, to find life, to not live drunk and asleep, but to live awake and sober. Like, that's the reason we wait on Jesus. It's not so that you can have it figured out and nobody else is ready. Like, it's so that you can live and be God's hands and feet in the world around you. That's the reason that we live it in light of Christ's return. And so Paul kind of alludes to something he explains much better in Ephesians, where he says, how do you do that? You put on God's armor. And I think this is cool too, because this is another progenitor of an idea that Paul gets really famous for, the armor of God. And he uses the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness. And if you remember our study on Ephesians, where we talk about the armor of God, you remember that the breastplate of righteousness, the righteousness is something that is attributed to us because of Jesus, right? Righteousness means you're in right standing with God. It's not that you're like a cool dude or a good person or whatever. No, you have Christ's righteousness. That's what protects you from the arrows of the enemy, from the barbs of this world, is that Christ's righteousness is attributed to you. And that's a big deal. And that our helmet of salvation, you never take your helmet off on a battlefield. It's what keeps you. You trust in your salvation. Not that that's the point, but that you've got it on. It's protecting you. You don't need to worry about it anymore. But never take it off, right? When you're in the battlefield, never take it off. So live your life as if Christ is coming back, and get to work. Make Jesus the king of your life. Make him the center of your life. Get into his word until it gets into you. Focus on the kingdom. Focus on what really matters, and ignore everything else. Don't put your trust in the politicians. Don't put your trust in the things of this world, because they're going to let you down. They're going to go away. Don't trust in peace and security, but instead trust in Jesus, that he is going to come back and he's going to get his people. And we're going to live eternity as his people in the place he's created for us in his direct presence. I hope this was encouraging and helpful to you. As always, if you have any questions, reach out to me any way you can. And otherwise, I'll see you next week.